Today's topic that I'm presenting is how to use Lighthouse to build a faster app. But like everything in life, I'm not the laziest person. But before doing anything, I ask myself, why am I doing this? Is this something I really want to do? Is this going to help me or not? So let's ask the same question, that why do we need faster apps, right? So let's see the impact of not having a fast website. Let's assume that your website loads 1 second slower. Instead of 5 seconds load time, it loads at a 6 second. That's when you are getting the content. The impact of that 1 second delay can be a 7% reduction in conversion rate. For those of you who have not worked in e-commerce, conversion rate is number of people visiting your website versus number of users actually purchasing something from your website. So if that number goes down by 7%, your website was previously selling, let's say, 1 lakh rupee every day worth of stuff. Now instead of that, it's only selling 93,000. You're losing 7,000 rupees every day, and that piles up over a time, right? So there is a direct impact in terms of financial loss. Second would be that 11%, let's say you're not selling something. Your website is just a blog or something kind of like a video game, online video game, so something else, not an e-commerce store. Still, it's going to affect your website page views by 11%. So now it's even more impact. Instead of 100 users per day, now you are getting only 89 users, right? In terms of customer satisfaction, again, everyone that accesses your website, not necessarily a customer, but they are user of your website, right? And you want to make sure that your users are satisfied, they are happy, and they get what they came for. When your website is just 1 second slower, around 16% of your customer satisfaction rate drops. And again, as it goes forward and forward, instead of, let's say, 6 seconds, now your website loads at 8 seconds. That kind of piles on and piles on. How many of you have searched something on Google that you thought that this might be something interesting, clicked on a link, it didn't open in first 4 or 5 seconds, and you just dropped? Because our minds are like used to getting so much information processing so quickly that now we take speed as like our right. Like if something is slower by even a second, we are not happy with it. So yeah, as I mentioned, there is a financial impact. As I mentioned, there is a customer satisfaction impact and page view impact as well of just having 1 second slower side. So yeah, your next question would be that, isn't everyone getting like the fastest internet every day? 2 years back, I needed internet at my home. I wanted like something really fast, but the maximum that my provider was willing to give me was 8 megabytes per second. Now that's not the case. I have a Geo Fiber. It has a 100 Mbps plan as well. But I have up for 50 Mbps. Same for mobile users as well. You would say that users have lots of bandwidth. They can just, even if your site is a little bit, you didn't optimize it, but your internet speed is going to cover for that. So let's look into that argument a little bit more detail. According to speedtest.net, average internet speed is 9.15 Mbps in India. Internet speed on fixed broadband is 28.5. So that seems pretty sufficient, right? You would think that there shouldn't be any problem at all. For even high-speed internet streaming on YouTube, they recommend that 2.5 Mbps is more than enough. So we definitely have more than that speed. But when you look into that data a little bit more detail, that's not the case. Internet is not available equally everywhere. Some of the South Indian cities have like way above that average rate, versus some of the other states and some of the other rural areas have really slow internet. Average speed goes from 3 megabytes all the way to 28 megabytes, 29 megabytes. So your customer could be someone in their coffee shop with really high-end laptop with really high-speed internet. Or it could be someone in a village trying to access your website in a really basic internet phone, smartphone or feature phone on like basic 3G network, or maybe even not that, right? So, and again, as everyone is saying that everyone is switching towards mobile, so mobile is getting more and more first device where user access internet. I forgot the number, but there is a certain above 50% number where those number of users have only used internet on their phone. They have never touched even laptop or computer ever in their life. So we want to make sure that whatever websites we build are compatible for those devices, are loading on their devices, because again, those users are going to be our customers. Just imagine that the rate at which internet is getting into everyone's hand, all those users will be your customers going forward. Yeah, so now we know that why it's needed. First, it's financially required. And second, there is a social responsibility on you as well, that you make sure that everyone has equal access to internet. So now you understand that it's needed, and there is a reason worth doing it. Then you would ask, how do I do this, right? First, you need to, your goal is now to deliver your website, your web application, as soon as possible to your users. But first, you need to find out what's wrong with your website, right? So, or your web application. I use those words interchangeably. So there is a tool, audit tool, that is already built into Chrome. All you need to do is right-click, inspect, or you can use F12 if you are a fan of shortcuts, and click on the audit tool, audit link of Chrome's developer tool. So initially they didn't brand name this tool. It was just audit tool, and this used to be there from the very beginning. But now they have created this open source project called Lighthouse, and that's their default audit application. So you have a couple of options here. You can simulate different scenarios. That do you want to test it for your mobile phone or your desktop? You have option that do you want to access the full speed of internet that you have available, or do you want to simulate 3G or 4G network? And they have a couple of different audits. Right now we are going to focus first on performance audit, but it has other audits as well. It has progressive web app audit, it has accessibility audit that Neha talked about this morning, which is again really important, goes along with this speed. Speed and accessibility goes hand in hand, right? So let's see, once you select your configuration, hit the button, it just does its thing. There is no installation, there is no programming required. It is a tool that's built in and it's doing its thing. One of my favorite things is while it's running the audit, it gives you funny quotes, or not necessarily funny quotes, but it gives you inspirational code. That example, it says like 0.5 seconds of speed improvement increased Walmart's sale by X millions. I forgot the number. Similarly, it tells you, it kind of motivates you that what are the impacts. So that's really fun to watch as well. And then it presents you with the results. So results are presented in terms of score, as well as detailed report as well. They give you score from 1 to 100. Definitely 1 is worse, like I don't think anyone would get 1, but as close to 100 as you can get, your website is performing that much better, right? But that score is just not enough. It's good to brag about, but in more important part is the different detail that it gives you. It tells you what are the different opportunities are available. It tells you what are the audits that are failing, and it also tells you which audits are passed. So let's say if you've done something perfectly good, it tells you that as well. So you get you can just congratulate yourself and feel good about it, right? So now you know that what's wrong, right? It tells you directly what are the things that's wrong. So now we need to go ahead and fix this, right? So in order to understand how to fix a web page, again, there is another question that how does a web page work to begin with? How does a web page load, right? So web page has 3 basic components. HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, right? Anyone who has done like 11 in even 10 standard, they have created a basic page. They have used these 3 components. So HTML gives your page a structure. It kind of tells that what is the content. CSS helps you kind of like give it some nice style. It makes the page pretty. And JavaScript can help you do some fun stuff, right? So these are essential things. You obviously need fonts, images, other media files and whatnot, but these are the basic building blocks. So let's understand, here is an example page, and again, I'm sorry, the contrast ratio is not great. I wish I attended the accessibility lecture before. I could have designed it a little bit better. So this is a simple page that has a head section, it has a title, it has a CSS file, it has a JavaScript file, it has a body that has some HTML, right? Just your bare bone basic web page. These are the things that are bound to be inside that. CSS, JavaScript, HTML, right? So let's understand how this page, how browser shows you this page. As soon as you hit something, let's say you hit google.com and press enter. Is everyone getting so far? Am I going too fast? This is my first this size of lecture, so let me know if I need to go slow or anything like that. So let's understand how Chrome or any other browser for that matter loads the web page, right? When you hit a domain name and hit enter or a whole page path, it's going to first resolve the DNS and server will start sending the data. So usually the first bytes that will be sent are going to be HTML text. So as soon as browser starts receiving HTML, it will start interpreting it and start constructing something called document object model. This document object model tells browser how to show something on the page. So this is ongoing process. As browser gets more and more bytes, as browser gets line by line, it can start displaying that content. So it's a non-blocking process. It can happen incrementally, right? But as soon as your browser hits a CSS file, now CSS can affect how your page looks, right? So your browser needs to stop that rendering process and it needs to load that CSS first. Once the CSS is loaded, it needs to create something called CSS OM. So it's same as document object model, it's a CSS object model. Then the browser combines these two, document object model and CSS object model, and again renders the page. Now the third element can be inside is script. JavaScript are really tricky animal. They can change your style sheet, they can change your HTML, they can use document.write, they can import other files as well. So in order to correctly process this JavaScript, web page has to stop doing all other processes. It needs to not only stop building DOM document object model, but it needs to also stop combining that DOM with CSS as well. So when you have CSS loading, at least some other processes can run in parallel. But when you have JavaScript loading, pretty much everything gets halted until the JavaScript is actually processed, right? So this tree kind of explains, and I'm sorry if I'm blocking the view, tree kind of explains, again, as I mentioned, first you are requesting a page, then you are getting a response, your HTML gets built into a document object model, you are getting CSS, you are getting JavaScript. While you are getting this, nothing happens. Once it has been fetched, then it will combine them and show you something, right? So let's say we wrote page like this. What will happen is first, it will show that head part. Here, if you can see, there is a title. So title is not blocked by anything else. So it will show a title on the page browsers tab, right? But because it's hitting CSS and JavaScript, before going and continue to process the rest of the part, it needs to load this and process this, right? So anything that's needed, that's absolutely needed in order to render your page is called critical rendering path. In order to render this content that's here, it must load this CSS, it must load this JavaScript, right? So that's the part of the process, and if you can control what's your critical rendering path, your page can either load like this on the left hand side, or sorry, on the top side, it can load like this incrementally, or it can just stay blank until everything is processed, and at the end it will show you all the content. So from user experience perspective, which one would you prefer? Would you rather wait the whole time and then see everything at once, or would you prefer to start seeing something? Any opinion? Start seeing something, right? So in order to achieve that, we need to find out what's our critical rendering path, and kind of control that path, try to optimize that path. And that's exactly what the Chrome Lighthouse tool does. It tells you what are the things that are in your critical rendering path, and then you can, once you know what is the rendering path, which are the things taking most time, you can kind of remove those items one by one, and put them in a different places. So we'll talk about that in a second. But another important thing is this definition: above fold and below fold. Whenever you load any web page, especially in a mobile phone, only first 20% of the page is visible to user, right? Your page might be really long, but you need to scroll in order to see that. So anything that you view above fold is critical for your user. We first understood what is critical rendering path for the browser, right? But now understand what's the critical for your user. So for user, it's critical to see at least something getting loaded. For your user, it's critical to see everything that's above the fold, right? So in order to achieve that, what we are going to do is change this HTML part a little bit. And these are the exact kind of hints that Chrome Lighthouse tool will give you. It will tell you that remove render blocking resources and then remove this CSS. So what it is saying here is your CSS that you have loaded on the top originally has too much content on it, and it's not being used for the above content path or above the fold page. So it will tell you that optimize that, create a separate CSS, if needed inline CSS as well, and only use that CSS on the head, right? So in order to load this header part, I'm sorry. Yeah. So in order to load this header and menu bar, whatever CSS you need, CSS goes in the head, right? All the other CSS that are required for below fold path, you can add it later. So just by changing the way you are including CSS, you have improved the user experience by a lot. Instead of seeing something after 3-4 seconds, now user will see something within first or second, within 1 or 2 seconds, right? Similarly, JavaScript as well, and I'm sorry, I might have missed something. Other important part is render blocking resources. Your JavaScript file, you can kind of like separate the JavaScript file. There could be a separate JavaScript file for a phone device, mobile device, versus tablet device versus a desktop device. So if your client is mobile user, they are only going to see the menu bar and probably the first slider that you have on the top, right? Versus if your user is on a desktop, they are going to see a lot more. So again, your strategy needs to be dynamic accordingly, and the way you design this dynamic, the way you define this dynamic policy is by using media query. You can say that if the max width is this, then load this CSS first. If the max device width is this, then load different CSS, right? So same for the CSS, location was important, right? But for JavaScript, location is everything, because as I mentioned earlier, JavaScript blocks everything. It will not render anything else unless JavaScript is loaded as well as it's executed. So remove any non-critical JavaScript from the header part, right? Your menu bar and your top header section, if it isn't using any pop-ups, don't include the pop-up JavaScript in the header section. If it is, if your page has add to cart feature, but add to cart function is below fold, don't add that JavaScript on the top part. It is going to have really negative impact. Just by changing the way CSS and JavaScript is added in a page, you can easily go 10 to 15 points up on that 1 to 100 score we talked about in terms of performance. And in terms of second advantage, it could be different according to your site, but at least point perspective, you will get a lot better.
Yeah.
And if there is a JavaScript that is needed to be loaded, you need the JavaScript, but it's not really needed until the whole page is loaded, right? So again, I will go back to that add to cart JavaScript. It's not going to be needed until everything is loaded, user is viewing this. So what you can do is you can write async attribute. So async attribute will let the JavaScript load without blocking all the other process, right? Similarly, you can use defer, but defer puts it into a little bit more lower priority. After everything is completed, your DOM and CSS object model are created and rendered. After that, it is going to use that defer. It's going to start importing that deferred JavaScript. So maybe in the cases where you are tracking user, maybe in a scenario where it's not critical to have that feature, it's a secondary feature. You can use it into that. So some e-commerce websites now have a feature where if you are moving mouse out towards the close button, it will show you a pop-up that, hey, instead of leaving, here is your 10% off coupon code. So showing those kind of coupon code, showing these kind of secondary functionality, if possible, try to defer those JavaScript loading, right? Yeah, so now you are going to not import CSS initially at all. So you have solved the biggest problem. Instead of loading it on the very beginning, now you are loading them as needed. But there is further optimization that can be done on CSS. If you are not using a CSS, why include that in the page, right? So that goes to another point I mentioned, that use media queries. If a CSS is specifically for mobile, don't load it on the desktop, right? Here's a quick example. Here there are two H1 and H2, both have a same background color, right? So instead of writing it like this, you can simply write it like this, right? And it saves a lot of byte that needs to be transferred over network. Furthermore, instead of writing it this, you can write it even furthermore, truncated. 6 zeros have same impact as 3 zeros, right? Instead of having a space in between, they are written just right next to each other. And it's still the same thing. But this process could be really tedious, especially if you have really long CSS files. So what you can do is use libraries and tools which are combined with your continuous integration, continuous delivery pipeline. And whenever you push a new code, before deploying that code, it will automatically minify this, right? It can minify this. It can also combine a lot of CSS together as well. That's another strategy that can be used. If you need 5 CSS at the end, merge them and then serve as a one file instead of requesting five different files separately, because each time there is additional work browser needs to do, it's going to have a negative impact on the performance. And yeah, again, that same defer and async can be used with CSS as well. So feel free to do that. One other thing that I see a lot while I'm working with my team is even if they're using a framework like Bootstrap, they would still try to write custom CSS a lot. Try to avoid that as much as possible. If you are committed to a framework, try to work within the parameters that are given by that framework, because you are importing that CSS anyway. Now you are overriding it and writing something else just to make minor changes. One of the good strategy is to download a Photoshop or Adobe Illustrator template for Bootstrap and give it to your designer, or ask your designers to understand how Bootstrap works, and tell them that you are going to use it in your programming, right? So if you're building in programming, it needs to be designed in according to the Bootstrap 12-column structure as well. Otherwise, you will have to write those unnecessary CSS. So educating everyone, making sure everyone is on same page is kind of important as well. Yeah, avoid CSS background images. So if, let's say, there is a CSS file, inside of that you have used background image. Now, browser needs to load that image as well, and then let's say your CSS has 10 different images, it gets interrupted 10 different times. If you must use images, try to use something called image sprite. So instead of 10 different images, you are just importing one image that has all 10 of them built into one image, and then you use position instead of position and size to load a subsection of that big image into your page. Yeah, I think I covered everything on CSS optimization. So based on my study of web pages generally have 10% of HTML or even less, 20 to 30% of CSS and JavaScript, but the biggest load, biggest resource that is on a web page are images. So whenever you are importing adding images on your web page, make sure that they are compressed. There are different compression techniques. According to your needs, you can use one of them. Lossless compression is something where image quality is not compromised. Whatever you are compressing, your browser can undo that, and then it will have exact same results. So savings happen during the network transmission, but your image quality doesn't suffer. Versus lossy compression is something where you are losing some information. So if you apply compression ratio to 80%, quality to 80%, it is going to do some sort of reduction that affects the quality. But do note that human eyes are easy to trick, right? If there is two images side by side, one that is 5 megabytes and other one that's 0.5 megabytes, they are not going to notice the difference, especially if it's an image that's like 200 px by 200 px image, right? So wherever possible, understand what are your user's needs are. If you can compress, if you can afford to do a lossy compression as well, right? And again, both type of compression, doesn't matter which library you use, it will automatically remove all the metadata. So any picture that you take from your camera, from your digital camera, mobile camera, it adds some metadata that where this picture was taken, which device it used, what was the shutter speed, and all those information will be stored inside the image. So these tools can easily strip that out. So one of the easiest thing you can do, let's say right now you have a website, you have hosted it on WordPress, let's say, and there is resources or images folder, right? You can just download this tool called Image Optim, drag all your files to that tool, hit compress, and it barely takes 2 minutes, and it will save you on any given web page. If the previous images were uncompressed, it is going to save you at least 50% of file size, right? Just for an example, I dragged some of my own screenshots that I prepared for this presentation, dragged it to this Image Optim tool, and it had averaged 76 to about 70% compression without applying any additional settings. This is the first screenshot is directly from the Chrome Lighthouse, and it tells you that this image that is being used, that is a lobby picture. Okay, first of all, this audit was run on this hotel's webpage. I just went on their website, ran the audit, and on an average, they can save 3 seconds by just compressing images. So just imagine doing all other optimization on top of it will save so much time, right? You would expect something better from a brand like Marriott, but even they are not perfect. Yeah, so manual process is great. Do it if you don't want to do a lot of work, but the best option is automating this process as well, right? So anytime, again, you push a build, make sure that your CI/CD pipeline has tools configured that can run compression on your media directory. Other place where we find images affecting performance a lot, so again, your theme and your website static content is already compressed, right? But there is another content that user uploads. Let's say you are building a social media website, and everyone is uploading pictures from that they have taken from their iPhone, Android devices, and whatnot. With dual lenses, file size can get up to 20 megabytes. So if you don't do anything, if you just let them upload the image, and display it on a feed, and a feed contains 10 images, that page will be never, like, it will take forever to load that page. So whenever user uploads an image, you need to make sure they are compressed in acceptable resolution, acceptable quality, and then stored. Otherwise, you will have to pay more for storage, and again, your other users will suffer as well. So do research on how you can convert manually, how you can compress files automatically as well. Other thing is image resolution. So compression is compressing a file size, right? Versus image resolution is what's your image's width and height, right? Let's say you have a website that has a banner on the top. Its width is 800px and height is 300px. Now, if your image that you are trying to load in that placeholder is larger than that size, you are wasting your bandwidth, you are wasting all your resources. You should be able to convert that image in a required resolution and then only serve it, right? One other important thing is, let's say instead of 200px by 200px, now your file is 400px by 400, right? Because again, images are square, we need to multiply that increased 200px on each side, and instead of file size being double, it will be 4 times. So it is very critical that you serve correctly sized images. Same process here as well. You can manually take care, make sure that your images are correctly sized. But a lot of time problem is that you don't know in which resolution you are going to display the image. Website can load probably in your mobile phone. You need it in different resolution. It's loaded in the desktop, you need different. Let's talk about, again, profile image. Let's say everyone uploaded profile image. On your feed page, you need really small 50px by 50px image size. But when you visit their profile, you need that same image in larger resolution. So for these kind of things, you can use libraries which are available that can convert images on demand. So we use this tool called Thumbor. You can configure it on your server, and then you can on demand request a custom size, and it will convert it the first time you request it and then store it. So each consecutive time you are requesting the same resolution, it's not going to convert again, so it won't waste that much time either, and serve you that exact image that you need. It can do other fun stuff like cropping and other things as well, but not relevant to this topic, right? Okay, so now we have optimized all 3 resources. Our web page was made out of HTML, CSS, JavaScript. We have optimized that. We use images a lot, so we have optimized that as well. Our page should be pretty fast already. But there are still some other things which are relatively newer features. Might not be supported in all browsers, but most latest browsers support it. Especially Chrome definitely supports it, right? So one such feature is pre-connect. Let's say your website is hosted on xyz.com. First time when you hit that xyz.com, your browser is going to do something called a domain name resolution, find out where your website is stored, and then fetch content from there. But now you have used other domains as well. Let's say you're getting fonts from Google, right? So now instead of your domain xyz.com, you need to fetch fonts from Google. So your browser needs to again find out what's the DNS of Google. Your JavaScript is stored on jQuery CDN. So again, it will have to go find out where jQuery.com is or jQuery.org, I'm not sure. Instead of trying to find out where, doing that DNS resolution on runtime, you can add this tag that can do that process up front. All you need to do is mention link, relation equal to pre-connect, and define all different domains that you are fetching data from. So 2 examples I mentioned, jQuery CDN, Google Font CDN. You can just mention those domains, and it will pre-resolve those. So when we need to import the font, it will save that 100 millisecond or 150 millisecond, right? Because we have already optimized a lot, now even milliseconds count. We want to make sure that we can optimize as much as we can. So this one only pre-connect only resolves the DNS, right? It doesn't load anything up front. But you can do something called prefetch. So again, this is a relatively new method as well. Instead of just connecting with DNS, you can actually load the entire resource up front as well. So this resource, dashboard.js, is not used yet, right? You don't need it right now, but you can upfront load it. And what this does is, if you need it on that same page later on, let's say you clicked on a pop-up that gives you similar product, right? And that pop-up loads this JavaScript. You have already loaded it, right? So it's not critical for your current page, but it's going to be needed really soon. So you are upfront loading that. It is a low priority hint to browser. It does not necessarily execute right away. It just tells you that I might need it. So once you are done with everything else, once you are free, go ahead and load this resource as well, right? So again, my example was, this is another good example as well. Let's say you are on a login page, and after login, you are going to display them dashboard. You are 100% certain that if users login gets completed, they are going to go on dashboard. So just load all the JS and CSS that you need on the dashboard from the login page itself, right? So user hits login, things will work really fast compared to how it would have worked otherwise. Yeah, so similar to prefetch, there is a preload as well. But as I mentioned, prefetch is just an hint. It doesn't really tell that load it right away. Versus preload actually starts loading that right away, right? So if this is a good example where you are loading fonts or images from your CSS, right? So while your CSS is loading and that CSS DOM is being constructed, you can upfront load all those images and all those fonts so CSS processing doesn't get interrupted, right? So yeah, it's kind of a tricky pre-connect just for domain, prefetch for something that you might need, preload something that you are definitely going to need, right? Okay. This is one of the other biggest one, but it's not completely front end. So for this, you need to reach out to your backend developers or whoever is managing your servers. gzip compression. So everyone has used zip compression, 7-zip or anything similar, right? All it does is compresses a file, you transport that file, uncompress, and get what you want to get, right? So same concept applies here. Your server, before transmitting the data, it compresses that. Your browser receives a compressed version, and your browser uncompresses it. All browsers supported, all major servers supported. I haven't come across a server that doesn't support it. But the benefit that you get is like phenomenal, 50 to 70%, depending on your data. If it's completely random, it's not going to compress. Again, basic fundamentals of compression. But if there are lots of things that are common that can be compressed, it will compress it. Will have a dramatic effect on your performance. Okay, browser cache. So far we talked about how to deliver things efficiently to browser from your server first time, right? But usually when you visit any website, you are not going to just visit one page, you are going to go inside and navigate more and more pages as well. It is likely that you might not just visit it one day, you might come back and visit something tomorrow as well, right? So all the browser creators came up with this great concept years and years back called browser caching. So if your browser doesn't have a specific resource, it will request that resource from server. Server will send that resource, and instead of just rendering it and showing it, it will also save it in the local storage of browser. Yeah. So first time your browser doesn't have a file, let's say it's a jQuery file, right? Your browser doesn't have that file, it will request, the server will send that file, browser will save it. Next time, when the same resource is requested on your subsequent page as well, you need jQuery, right? So it will going to check that do I already have this resource or not? If I do have that resource, I'm going to just use that instead of trying to get it again. Now, how many of you as a web developer have asked your client after doing some fix or release that, oh, have you tried cleaning the cache, right? Everyone has been there. So cache could be really great. It can increase your performance by a lot, but at the same time, it can make the update process really painful. You fix something, that resource is cached, and now they are still on the old version, right? So it is really important that you build effective, I can just say that. Yeah, it's really important that you build effective cache policy, cache strategy, before actually sending and telling browser that cache this content versus cache this content, right? So general idea is, let's say you are using a library, let's say it's a Bootstrap library, let's say it's a jQuery, all those resources, they are not going to change, right? So cache as much as possible, try to apply maximum caching for those. Even if there is a new version, you will change the URL, right? So if URL changes, it's going to request a new version anyway. If it's your custom JavaScript, right? You have something written on top of it that does your own business logic. Cache it moderately, so make sure that it still does get cached, but you have some control over it. You can change and tell browser when to update this, right? If it's theme images or any other images that are not user-generated images, again, try to cache it if possible. Any dynamic content, any private API that has users' data, have a strict no cache policy applied for it, right? So again, I didn't go into that much detail given the time constraint, but essentially you have to set custom headers and tell browser which content is going to be cached, which one is not going to be cached, right? Most important is this E tag. So you can use, I forgot the name, but you can send a validity in terms of timestamp, or you can use a relatively newer concept called E tag. So when you, let's say, again, same example, you sent a jQuery file. Along with that file, you will send the browser that this is the E tag, this is the current version. Think of it as a version number. This is the version 1 of this file, right? So next time, instead of, whenever you have sent E tag, instead of directly taking it from browser, next time you request it, it will still make a request to server and say that I have version 1. Do you have a newer version? If not, just tell me. If you do have a newer version, send me the new version. So server is going to just tell you that version hasn't changed, E tag is still same. You can use the previous file, right? If it has been changed, it will deliver you version 2 as well as new E tag that you can then validate for the future request. Other precaution that you can use besides E tag is something called URL fingerprinting. So let's say you implement a new version of a same file. That URL changes slightly. It's not the same URL, right? So you can do it by appending a timestamp at the end of the URL as a query string. So that way you can optimize or utilize maximum benefits of cache without having side effects, right? So make sure that next time you never have to ask that, oh, have you tried cleaning the cache, right? It can be solved easily if it's done correctly. Okay, so I only have 5 minutes. I wasn't sure if I'll be able to cover everything or not, but this covers key essential benefits or essential things that Lighthouse tells you that you need to fix. So again, just a quick recap. Make sure you know what's your critical rendering path. Update location of your CSS, JavaScript, and other files to optimize that rendering path so your web page can start loading as soon as possible, right? If you're using images, make sure you compress them. If you are ask your server, whoever is managing your server, make sure that they are using gzip compression. They are doing it as aggressively as possible. Make sure that you are sending correct cache headers, both to get full advantage as well as avoid problems, right? So Lighthouse doesn't stop at just doesn't stop at performance. It gives you other hints as well, other audits as well. So there is one, accessibility. This morning we talked about accessibility. It was a really great presentation. So all those audits, the same tool can tell you that you are doing something wrong. So your image should have alternate attribute. Every element should be accessible through tab navigation. You should be able to press tab and should be able to access everything, right? So make sure that you check against that as well. If, as mentioned, by default, internet is accessible, web pages are accessible, so it must be something that you have done, might be affecting this, and should be a simple fix. So doesn't hurt to run audit, right? Best practices as well. Make sure that you have correct security best practices implemented. Again, it will just list out anything that you are failing for. Let's say you are not using HTTPS, it will tell you that. Same for UX as well. It will give you some ideas that you shouldn't ask unnecessary permissions. How many of you hate Android just because every time you open app, it asks you 7 different permissions, right? So same thing with browsers as well. News websites especially, they will ask for push notification, location, all the things like don't do that unless user has explicitly clicked on a button, right? Don't ruin their user experience. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I hope everyone who is managing a website, they have built a website or using a website, will go home, open Chrome, right click, inspect, audit, and run the audit, right? So you will at least find out if you are doing great, then yeah, just brag about it. If you are not doing something right, then you can go and find out what can be done, what is the least amount you can done, and improve your website's performance, right? Any questions? Yeah.
Yeah, can I just elaborate over that link, CDN link thing? Because as that CDN link thing that you mentioned in this slide,
Prefetch?
preloading, prefetch, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, what does it prefetch? Because as far as my understanding, the CDN links will provide. So that is according to the it will give the DNS will give the location of the most nearest server which contains that thing.
So instead of whenever, let's say you have not done that, right? You have directly mentioned link and then that CSS file, right? So when we mentioned that HTML document object model happens incrementally. So whenever it will hit that URL, and if your browser doesn't know the DNS address, right, of that CDN, whatever is nearest, again, you still need somewhere some IP address to load resource from, right? So it will waste some time in finding out that. Instead of that, here you are upfront telling that I'm going to need this, right? So start looking for it. So whenever browser gets idle time, it can start looking into that. So it's just trying to do it early. It does the same thing, it just does it early. Yeah. Anyone else? Okay. Thanks everyone.